You need to watch this if you struggle with fear or love a good scare. The jester will prepare a place for you. Imagine a room cloaked in darkness. Your heart races, senses on high alert. Welcome to the Jester Game, brought to you by the twisted minds behind Storybook Coins. This Jester Game will leave you mad. Here's how it works. A host, dressed as a jester, sets up a room filled with your worst nightmares. It could be anything, from creepy dolls to spine-chilling whispers. Your challenge? To sit or stand in that room in complete darkness for the desired amount of time. Feeling brave yet? Here's the catch. If you decide you can't handle it, you can signal to quit at any moment. But if you stick it out, you'll have to face what's in the room before claiming your prize. Think you can outsmart the jester and conquer your fears? This game isn't just about endurance, it's about confronting what lurks in the shadows of your mind. So gather your courage, dim the lights, and step into the jester's realm. The prize awaits, but so does the terror.
That's really and all of this.
This is Storybook Radio.
Long before anyone began calling him death-defying, Marcus Vale had already stopped believing his life belonged to him. Marcus stood just over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a worn, tired look that had settled into his face over the years. There had been a time when the casinos felt like home, the warm glow of slot machines spilling colored light across carpet, patterned in endless spirals, the quiet clatter of chips sliding across felt tables, the calm confidence of dealers whose hands moved faster than the eye could follow. For him, it wasn't only about the money. It was the sensation of possibility, the belief that the next hand, the next spin, the next perfectly timed bet could undo every mistake that had come before it. He chased that feeling relentlessly. Night after night, he drifted between blackjack tables, poker rooms, and smoky sidebars where gamblers compared stories about fortunes lost and won in the same breath. Sometimes he walked away ahead, just enough to convince himself he had the system figured out. More often, he left with less than he started. Still, he kept playing, because gamblers rarely remember their losses the way they remember the moments when the odds briefly tilted in their favor. Eventually, the casinos stopped welcoming him, so the games moved elsewhere. One night, he found himself inside a narrow pool hall tucked between a laundromat and an abandoned storefront. The place smelled faintly of chalk dust, beer, and old carpet soaked with years of cigarette smoke. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, while a handful of men leaned against the walls, watching the game unfold. The table in the center had turned into something more than pool. Cash moved across the rail with every shot. At first, the bets were small, $20, then $50, then $100. The rhythm of the game changed as the stakes climbed, the room growing quieter with each rack. The men around the table stopped joking. Even the bartender slowed his movements as he watched. Soon the man's wallet emptied, but gamblers rarely stop when the money disappears. They begin wagering pieces of their life instead. His car keys landed on the rail of the table. The room grew still. The game continued. Several shots later, the final ball dropped into the corner pocket with a hollow clack that echoed across the room. He had lost. The men took the keys without celebration, sliding them off the rail and into a pocket as if collecting something that had always belonged to them. No one said anything. There was nothing left to say. So he stepped outside and called home. His wife answered. He explained what had happened with the same tired voice he had used many times before. She didn't yell. She didn't lecture him the way she once might have years earlier. Instead, she sighed quietly. "I'll come get you," she said. The line went silent. He waited outside the pool hall beneath a flickering street lamp, pacing slowly along the sidewalk while the minutes stretched longer than they should have. Cars passed occasionally. Somewhere down the block, a radio played through an open window. He checked his phone. No messages. Then the police arrived. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb. The officers stepped out slowly, the expressions on their faces already telling him something had gone terribly wrong. Halfway to the pool hall, the car his wife was driving had been struck by a truck that ran a red light at full speed. The impact crushed the side of the vehicle. His wife died instantly. So did his 2 children in the back seat. The officer explained it gently, carefully choosing each word the way people do, when they know language can't soften the truth. None of them survived. For a long time, the man simply stood there beneath the broken street lamp, staring past the officers toward the empty road, as though the explanation might suddenly change. His wife had always stayed beside him through everything, through the casino nights, through the debts, through the promises he made every time he swore he was finished gambling for good. She believed in him long after he stopped believing in himself. She had been more than his partner. She had been his closest friend and his children. They had been the one part of his life that still felt pure, untouched by the chaos he kept creating around himself. After that night, the future stopped feeling real. Everything that mattered had been riding in that car, and now it was gone. As if those losses weren't enough, Marcus had been fired 2 days before the fatal crash. One afternoon in the warehouse break room, a deck of cards snapped sharply against the table as he dealt another hand. A few co-workers leaned forward with quiet intensity. Small bills scattered between coffee cups and folded lunches. Marcus didn't notice the supervisor standing in the doorway until the room went silent. The cards hung halfway in the air. Someone cleared their throat. Marcus looked up. The supervisor simply shook his head once. No shouting, no speech. Just a slow gesture toward the exit. Marcus gathered his things without arguing. A small cardboard box held the few items from his locker. A thermos, a photograph he didn't look at, and a spare deck of cards someone had given him months earlier. By the end of the day, he was gone. A week later, he was sleeping in a small rental house his brother owned on the far side of town. The place felt temporary, bare walls, a single kitchen chair. The kind of house people pass through without leaving memories behind. Marcus preferred it that way. The silence suited him. But silence has a way of growing louder the longer a person sits with it. Eventually the thought came. Not dramatic, not emotional, just a quiet conclusion. There was nothing left for him here. The first attempt happened in the garage. Marcus stood beneath the ceiling beam, turning a piece of rope slowly in his hands. He tied the knot with careful precision, the same knot he had used weeks ago while securing equipment on construction sites. His movements were calm, methodical. He placed an overturned paint bucket beneath the beam and stepped onto it. For a moment he simply stood there. The garage smelled faintly of dust and motor oil. Marcus slipped the rope over his neck and stepped off the bucket. The beam cracked. The rope snapped. Marcus slammed onto the concrete floor hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. He lay there, numb to the fall, staring up at the broken wood above him, while the rope dangled uselessly from the beam. Slowly he pushed himself onto his elbows. He looked at the rope, then at the beam. A confused laugh slipped out of him. "That should have worked," he whispered. The second attempt happened at the kitchen table. Marcus sat alone beneath the yellow glow of the overhead light with a bottle of whiskey and a handful of pills spread across the wood. He studied them for a long moment before washing them down with a long drink. The house grew quiet. His vision blurred. Eventually, the table disappeared into darkness. Morning arrived. Marcus woke up on the bathroom floor with the empty pill bottle rolling slowly against the tile. He blinked up at the ceiling. For several seconds he didn't move. Then he sat up slowly, rubbing his face as confusion crept across his expression. "I should be dead," he muttered. The third attempt felt more certain. There was a bridge outside the city where the highway crossed a wide stretch of river. Marcus climbed the railing just after midnight, while traffic rushed past behind him in long streaks of light. He looked down. The water moved slowly beneath the moon. Marcus stepped forward. The fall felt longer than expected. Cold air rushed past him before the world exploded into darkness and stone. When he opened his eyes again, the sky was still above him. Marcus lay against the rocky bank beside the river. The wind fanned water to his arms. He coughed, then slowly sat up. For a long moment he simply stared at the water flowing beside him. "I fell," he said quietly to himself. His voice carried genuine surprise. He stood unsteadily brushing dirt from his clothes while the realization slowly settled into his mind. "I fell." Marcus looked up toward the bridge high above him. "And I'm still here." After that, the attempts became less careful. A knife slipped from his hand, a gun jammed, a fall occurred and didn't break a single bone. Every time Marcus survived. At first he blamed bad luck, then coincidence. But after the fifth attempt, The pattern became impossible to ignore. Something, whether it was fate, chance, or something stranger, refused to let him die. And for the first time since losing his family, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected: confusion. Because no matter how many times he tried, death never took him. Marcus stopped trying to die after a while, not because the desire had disappeared, but because the attempts themselves had begun to feel pointless. Each time he pushed himself toward the edge, something intervened, something small and ordinary that turned what should have been a final moment into another quiet morning of waking up still alive. The rope snapped, the pills failed, the fall didn't kill him. Eventually, the effort itself felt exhausting, like fighting against something invisible that refused to let him go. So he drifted instead. Hours passed slowly, nights stretched longer. The bar was unusually quiet. Only a few stools were occupied, the kind of slow evening where the bartender had more time to polish glasses than serve drinks. A dull amber light hung over the counter, reflecting softly off the wood, while an old ceiling fan pushed warm air around the room. Marcus Vale sat near the end of the bar. His shoulders slouched forward, elbows resting against the counter, a half-empty glass sitting untouched in front of him. His eyes looked tired in the way that comes from too many sleepless nights rather than physical exhaustion. The tall, balding bartender noticed. He had been in the business long enough to recognize the difference between someone who came to drink and someone who came to think. He walked over slowly and wiped the counter in front of Marcus. "Rough night?" he asked. Marcus gave a small, hollow smile without lifting his head. "You wouldn't believe me." The bartender shrugged lightly. "Try me." Marcus stared into the glass for a moment, turning it slowly between his fingers as though the answer might be hidden somewhere in the reflection. "I've been trying to die," he said quietly. The bartender didn't laugh. He didn't look shocked either. Years behind a bar had introduced him to every kind of confession a person could make when they believed no one was listening. "Yeah," he said calmly. Marcus nodded. "I tried a rope," he continued. The beam snapped. He paused. "I swallowed a bottle of pills, woke up on the bathroom floor." Another pause. "Jumped off a bridge." The bartender leaned against the counter. "And?" Marcus lifted his eyes. "I'm still here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The bartender poured a fresh drink and slid it toward him. "You ever think maybe you're just hard to kill?" he said. Marcus gave a tired laugh. "That's not exactly helpful." The bartender nodded toward the television mounted above the shelves. A stunt show was playing, some daredevil launching a motorcycle over a row of cars, while a crowd screamed in excitement. "People pay to watch that stuff," he said. Marcus followed his gaze. "So?" The bartender shrugged. "If death keeps missing you," he said casually, "maybe you should stop chasing it." Marcus looked back down at his glass. The bartender added one more thought before walking away. "Or," he said, "at least let people watch." Marcus sat there for a long time after that. The idea followed him out of the bar. A week later, Marcus stood on the edge of an unfinished parking structure. The wind pushed lightly against his coat, while the quiet city stretched beneath him in rows of headlights and street lamps. Someone walking along the sidewalk noticed him first and stopped. Then another person paused. Within minutes, a small crowd gathered below, people pointing upward while phones lifted into the air to record whatever might happen next. Marcus looked down. 4 stories of open air separated him from the pavement. Someone shouted for him to get down. Someone else yelled that the police were coming. A few people simply watched with the strange excitement that appears whenever danger unfolds in public. Marcus stepped forward. The fall lasted only seconds. He crashed through a stack of construction insulation piled beside the building, the impact exploding into a cloud of white dust that sent people rushing toward him. Shouts filled the air as several onlookers pushed closer, expecting to find a broken body buried beneath the debris. Instead, the insulation shifted. Marcus sat up slowly. Dust clung to his coat and drifted through the air, while the crowd froze in stunned silence. For several seconds, no one spoke. They simply stared as he pushed himself to his feet, brushing the white fibers from his sleeves as though he had only stumbled down a set of stairs. "You all right?" someone shouted. Marcus looked around at the circle of faces. He nodded. The crowd erupted. People laughed, shouted, and pushed closer while phones stayed raised in the air, capturing every second of it. Someone clapped him on the back. Someone else yelled for him to do it again. Marcus didn't answer, but the video appeared online that night. By morning, thousands of people had watched it. A few days later, he tried something different. Rush hour traffic streamed through a wide intersection downtown, while drivers leaned impatiently on their horns. Marcus stepped calmly off the curb and walked into the middle of the road, planting himself between the lanes while headlights rushed toward him from both directions. Brakes screamed. Cars skidded sideways. Drivers shouted through open windows. Marcus stood perfectly still while the vehicle stopped inches from his body. Phones appeared along the sidewalks. Someone climbed onto the hood of a car to record a better angle, while pedestrians gathered behind the crosswalk. After a long moment, Marcus simply stepped out of the intersection. Behind him, the traffic exploded back into motion. The stunts escalated from there. On a construction site, he allowed workers to lock him inside a steel container, while a crane operator lifted several tons of concrete blocks above it. The crowd watched from behind barriers while the load dropped. The container collapsed with a violent screech of twisting metal. Dust filled the air. When the wreckage settled, workers pried open the bent door expecting the worst. Marcus crawled out. Alive. Soon the crowds began arriving before he did. People gathered along sidewalks, rooftops, and parking lots whenever rumors spread that Marcus Vale was planning another stunt somewhere in the city. Cameras appeared everywhere now. Phones, news crews, even drones hovering overhead to capture better views. Each act carried the same promise. This one should kill him. Yet every time Marcus walked away. Someone in the crowd finally said it out loud one afternoon, while Marcus climbed down from the frame of a collapsed structure. "That guy can't die." The name stuck. Soon everyone was saying it. The man who couldn't die. Marcus never corrected them, because deep down, he still believed the next stunt might finally prove them wrong. One afternoon, Marcus stood on a long stretch of railroad track outside the city, where the rails cut through an industrial yard filled with rusted containers and empty warehouses. Word had spread quickly that something big was about to happen. Hundreds of people gathered along the gravel beside the tracks. Some stood behind temporary fencing. Others climbed onto crates and truck beds for a better view. News vans lined the road, while drones hummed quietly overhead, capturing the moment from the sky. Down the track, a locomotive waited. The engine roared to life, smoke rolling from its stack while the steel wheels began turning slowly against the rails. Marcus stepped onto the track. The ground vibrated beneath his boots as the train began moving toward him. At first it crept forward, then it gained speed. The rumble deepened, echoing across the open yard while the enormous engine grew larger with every second. People in the crowd began shouting. Some yelled for him to move. Others raised their phones higher, unwilling to miss the moment if it turned deadly. Marcus stood perfectly still. The horn blared. The train barreled forward, the ground shaking now, while the air filled with the thunder of steel and momentum. The engine rushed closer until the massive iron front nearly filled his entire view. Someone screamed. Then, the brakes slammed. Metal shrieked against metal as sparks burst from the wheels grinding along the rails. The train lurched violently, the massive weight of the engine fighting its own momentum while the roar of breaking steel echoed across the yard. The locomotive skidded forward, closer, closer. The front of the engine finally shuddered to a stop, 1 inch from Marcus's chest. The air went silent. Steam hissed from the train, while Marcus stood motionless in front of the towering machine, close enough to see the scratches in the paint and the heat rippling from the engine. For several seconds, no one in the crowd spoke. Then the cheering began. The sound erupted across the yard as people shouted and clapped, stunned laughter spilling from the tension that had just broken. Phones pointed in every direction, while cameras captured Marcus standing calmly in front of the train, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Marcus stepped down from the rail. That when he noticed a familiar face. She stood in sweater dress, slim, with a radiant jawline. She was farther back than most of the crowd, near the edge of the yard, where gravel met the cracked pavement of an old loading lot. While everyone else celebrated, she remained still. Marcus had seen her before, at other stunts, different locations, different crowds, but always there, standing quietly with the same small notebook tucked under one arm. During the roar of applause, she didn't cheer. She simply wrote something down. Later that evening, she approached Marcus while he packed equipment into the back of a truck. "Marcus Vale?" she asked. Marcus looked up. She stood a few feet away holding the notebook open in one hand. "My name is Elena Ward," she said. "I'm a journalist." Marcus wiped his hands on his jacket. "What do you want?" "I've been watching your stunts," she said. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You enjoy watching people almost die?" Elena shook her head. "I'm not watching the stunts." Marcus frowned. "Then what are you watching?" She met his eyes calmly. "I'm watching you." Marcus studied her for a moment. Most reporters asked about danger, about thrill-seeking, about the crowd. But she wasn't asking about any of that. She was studying him. "I want to understand something," she said. "What's that?" "Why a man who can't die," she said quietly, "keeps trying to." Marcus saw her again the following week. By then the crowds had grown large enough that he had begun scanning the edges of them before each stunt, almost without thinking. Most of the people arrived loud and excited, phones already raised before he even appeared, hoping to capture the moment when something finally went wrong. Elena Ward was never like that. She stood with her notebook in hand, watching quietly while everything unfolded around her. She didn't shout, didn't laugh, didn't flinch when danger came close. She simply observed. That afternoon, the stunt took place inside an abandoned textile mill on the edge of the city. The building had been empty for years. Broken windows lined the upper floors, and the brick walls were stained dark from decades of weather and neglect. Yellow caution tape stretched across the entrances, while a crowd gathered behind temporary barricades in the cracked parking lot outside. Marcus stood near the front door, while a small crew finished wiring several explosive charges inside the structure. Nothing powerful enough to level the building, but enough to collapse sections of the interior walls and staircases. The challenge was simple. Marcus would walk through the building. The bombs would detonate. He had to make it out before the structure came down around him. News cameras pointed toward the doorway. Drones hovered above the roofline. Marcus glanced once at the crowd, spotting Elena. She stood near the edge of the barricades, her dark hair moving gently in the wind, while she held the same notebook against her chest. While the crowd buzzed with excitement, she remained still, watching him with the same quiet focus she always carried. Marcus held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked into the building. Inside, the air smelled of dust and rust. Long corridors stretched through the mill, the wooden floors creaking beneath his boots, while broken machinery sat abandoned along the walls. Red lights blinked softly beside the explosive charges that had been fixed to support beams and stair rails. A voice crackled through a speaker outside. 10 seconds. Marcus walked faster. 5. The hallway opened toward the rear exit. 3. Marcus broke into a run. Then the first explosion hit. The blast echoed through the building with a violent crack that shook the floor beneath his feet. Dust burst from the ceiling as the shockwave rolled down the corridor behind him. Another explosion followed, then another. Walls cracked, wood splintered. Marcus sprinted down the final hallway while debris began falling from above. A staircase collapsed behind him with a thunderous crash that sent fragments of brick and plaster skidding across the floor. The rear door stood ahead. Marcus lunged through it. Behind him, the building erupted with a final blast that blew dust and shattered glass out through the broken windows. The ground trembled as part of the roof collapsed inward with a deep groaning sound. Marcus stumbled forward onto the pavement outside. Alive. For a moment, the crowd stood frozen. Then the cheering began. People shouted and clapped, while cameras captured Marcus standing in the open air, with smoke and dust rising behind him from the ruined building. Marcus brushed debris from his jacket and looked toward the crowd. He found her immediately. Elena hadn't moved. She stood exactly where she had been before, her eyes fixed on him, while the noise of the crowd swirled around her. Slowly she opened her notebook and wrote something down. Later, when the crowd had begun to thin and the smoke drifted away from the wreckage, she approached him again. Marcus sat on the bumper of a truck, while a crew packed equipment into crates nearby. "Elena," he said when he saw her. "You remembered," she replied with a faint smile. Marcus shrugged. "You keep showing up." She glanced back at the shattered mill. Does it ever scare you? She asked. Marcus followed her gaze. The explosions? No, she said quietly. Living. Marcus looked at her for a moment. The noise of the crew faded into the background, while the last pieces of debris settled inside the ruined building. I was scared once, he said. Elena waited. Before the accident. And now? Marcus leaned back slightly and stared at the fading light above the mill. Now I perform more stunts. For what? She asked. Marcus looked back at her. Then she closed her notebook and sat beside him on the bumper of the truck. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And though Marcus didn't say it out loud, a quiet realization settled somewhere deep inside him. Out of every spectator who attended his stunts, someone was watching him, not to see if he would die, but to understand why he was still alive. Marcus began noticing her more after that. Not just in the crowd, but in the quiet moments after the noise faded, when the cameras packed up, when the crowds drifted away, when the air settled and the city returned to its ordinary rhythm. Elena Ward seemed to appear in those spaces where everything slowed down. She never rushed him with questions. Instead, she sat nearby, while he cooled down from whatever insanity he had just survived, her notebook resting closed on her knee, while she studied him with the same patient attention she had shown from the crowd. Sometimes she wrote a few lines. Sometimes she simply watched. At first, Marcus treated her like the rest of the media, someone curious, someone passing through. But weeks passed, and Elena kept returning. They began talking between the stunts. At first, the conversations were simple, questions about logistics, how the stunts were planned, how the crowds found out about them so quickly. Marcus answered casually, brushing most of it off with a shrug or a half smile. But Elena never asked the questions everyone else asked. She never said, "Aren't you afraid?" She never said, "Why would you do this?" Instead, she asked quieter things. How long do you wait before deciding what stunt comes next? Do you ever dream about the moment before you jump? What does the silence feel like right before something explodes? Marcus didn't always answer right away. Sometimes he thought about the questions for a while before speaking, and sometimes the answers surprised even him. One evening, they sat on the hood of Marcus's truck near the river, where the city lights shimmered across the water. He had just finished a stunt involving a collapsing crane cable that should have dropped a steel container directly on top of him. The container had missed him by inches. The video had already begun spreading online. Elena sat beside him, her legs crossed at the ankles while she watched the river. "People think you're chasing danger," she said. Marcus stared out at the water. "I'm not chasing anything." "Then what are you doing?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. A boat moved slowly beneath the bridge in the distance, its motor humming softly through the evening air. Finally, he said, "I'm waiting for the one." Elena studied him quietly with discomfort caught in her throat. "You really want to die?" Marcus didn't hesitate. Yes. The honesty hung between them. But instead of recoiling, Elena simply nodded, as if the answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "That's what makes you interesting," she said softly. Marcus looked at her. "Most people who want to die," she continued, "hide from it. They drink, they disappear, they slowly ruin themselves." She gestured toward the city behind them. "You do the opposite." Marcus followed her gaze. "What's that? You dare death to come get you?" Marcus almost laughed. "Death hasn't been very cooperative." Elena smiled faintly at that. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence again. Then she asked the question that lingered beneath everything else. "What happened to you?" Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. He hadn't talked about that part, not with anyone. But something about the quiet patience in Elena's voice made the silence feel heavier than the truth. "My family," he said finally. Elena didn't interrupt. Marcus stared down at his hands. "My wife was driving to pick me up one night," he said. "Pool hall across town. I'd been gambling again." The word tasted bitter. "I lost my car in a bet." Elena remained still. She was on the highway with the kids when a truck ran a red light. Marcus exhaled slowly. They didn't make it. The river moved quietly beside them. Elena lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. Marcus nodded once. "That's when the stunt started?" Marcus looked back toward the city lights. "No," he said. "That's when the dying started." Elena understood the difference immediately. For a long moment, neither of them spoke again. But something had changed. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt shared. And though Marcus didn't realize it yet, something else had changed too. Since the accident, someone had begun quietly pulling him back toward life. The stunts continued, but something subtle began to change. Marcus noticed it during a rooftop jump several weeks later. The setup had drawn one of the largest crowds yet. An unfinished apartment tower stood over the city like a hollow skeleton of steel and concrete, its top floor open to the wind. Barricades filled the street below, while hundreds of people gathered along the sidewalks, their phones raised toward the roof, where Marcus stood near the edge. News vans lined the intersection. Drones hovered above the construction site. The plan was simple on paper. Marcus would leap from the rooftop and land on a massive inflatable platform placed in the street below. The margin for error was narrow, but narrow margins were exactly what people came to see. Marcus stepped onto the ledge. Wind moved across the roof, tugging lightly at his jacket, while the city stretched outward beneath him in long lines of traffic and glass towers. The platform below looked smaller from this height than it had during the planning. Marcus scanned the crowd out of habit, and he saw her. Elena Ward stood near the barricade like she always did, slightly apart from the others. Her dark hair moved gently in the wind, while the notebook rested loosely in one hand. She wasn't cheering or shouting like the rest of the crowd. She was watching him. Marcus turned back toward the edge. For months he had stepped into danger without thinking about who might be watching when something finally went wrong. Now the thought lingered. Someone from the crew shouted from behind him, "Ready!" Marcus nodded once. Then he jumped. The wind rushed upward as the building dropped away beneath him. For a brief moment, the world seemed perfectly silent, except for the pounding of air in his ears while the ground raced toward him. Then he hit the platform. The inflatable cushion collapsed under the force of the fall before springing back upward, but Marcus landed awkwardly, his shoulder striking the edge of the frame beneath the padding. A sharp crack of pain shot through his arm as the platform buckled beneath him. Marcus rolled onto his side with a strained breath. The crowd cheered at first. Then the cheering faltered. Marcus pushed himself upright, but his left arm refused to move properly. Pain burned through his shoulder while the platform shifted beneath him. Before the crew could even reach him, someone else had already crossed the barricade. Elena. She pushed past the stunned spectators and hurried across the street toward the platform. By the time Marcus slid off the cushion onto the pavement, she was already there. "Marcus," she said breathlessly. He tried to stand. His legs held, but the pain in his shoulder forced him slightly forward. Elena caught him before he stumbled. Her arm slipped around his back while she helped steady him, her other hand gripping his wrist to keep him balanced. "Easy," she said quietly. Marcus exhaled sharply. For the first time since the stunts had begun, something had actually hurt. Not enough to kill him, but enough to remind him how close things could come. The crew finally rushed over. "Are you okay?" someone shouted. Marcus nodded once. "Shoulder," he muttered. They began examining the joint while Elena stayed beside him, her hand still braced lightly against his back as if making sure he didn't fall. Marcus looked at her. "You ran pretty fast for a journalist." Elena ignored the joke. "You're hurt," she said. Marcus gave a faint smile. "First time." Her eyes didn't soften. "That's not funny." For a moment, the noise of the crowd faded behind them. Marcus realized something strange. When he jumped from rooftops or stepped in front of speeding machines, he had never cared what happened afterward. But standing there now, slightly leaning against Elena while the ache pulsed through his shoulder, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his thoughts. Concern, not for the stunt, for her. Because when she had run toward him, her face had carried something he had never expected to see. Fear, not fear of the stunt. Fear of losing him. The crowd lingered longer than usual that evening. Word spread quickly that Marcus Vale had finally been hurt, and the rumor moved through the gathered spectators with a strange mixture of excitement and concern. Cameras remained pointed toward the ambulance that had arrived at the edge of the street, though Marcus refused to climb inside it. "It's just a shoulder," he insisted while the medic carefully rotated his arm. "Feels worse than it is." The medic frowned but eventually stepped back. "Nothing broken," he said, But you'll feel it tomorrow? Marcus gave a small nod. The crowd slowly began to disperse, disappointed that the man who couldn't die had once again escaped anything serious. The crew packed equipment into trucks while the inflatable platform was deflated and folded away. Elena remained beside Marcus the entire time. When the last of the cameras left and the street finally returned to its ordinary quiet, she spoke again. You should still have it checked. Marcus rolled his shoulders slightly and winced. I've had worse. You said this was the first time you've been hurt. Marcus smiled faintly. First time during a stunt. Elena didn't smile back. That's exactly why you should take it seriously. Marcus studied her expression. There was something different in her voice now, something deeper than curiosity. Concern. Relax, he said gently. If death hasn't taken me yet, I doubt a bruised shoulder will finish the job. Elena looked away toward the street where the crowd had stood only minutes earlier. That's not funny, Marcus. The quiet between them stretched for a moment. Finally, Marcus pushed himself upright from the truck and stretched his arm carefully. I'm hungry, he said. You? Elena blinked slightly, caught off guard by the sudden change of subject. A little. Marcus nodded toward a diner glowing across the street. Come on? They crossed the road together, the city settling into the slower rhythm of evening traffic, while the lights of restaurants and storefronts flickered on one by one. Inside the diner, the air smelled like coffee and fried food. They slid into a booth near the window. For a while, neither of them spoke. Marcus studied the menu while Elena watched him across the table, her notebook resting beside her, untouched. Finally, she asked quietly, Why didn't you stop? Marcus glanced up. When? After the accident. Marcus set the menu down slowly. The waitress arrived, poured 2 cups of coffee, and left again before either of them spoke. Marcus stared into the dark surface of the drink. When my family died, he said, I figured the universe made a mistake. Elena listened carefully. I should have been in that car, he continued. Not them. So you tried to correct it. Marcus nodded slightly. At first. Elena waited. And when that didn't work? Marcus leaned back in the booth. Then I figured maybe the universe just needed help. Elena understood what he meant immediately. The stunts, the explosions, the falling buildings. He wasn't chasing fame. He was forcing the moment. But now something else sat quietly between them. Elena wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and asked the question that had begun forming in her mind ever since she ran to him on the street. What if the reason you haven't died yet, she said slowly, is because you're not supposed to? Marcus looked at her. The question lingered in the air between them. Outside the diner window, headlights drifted past along the street. Marcus considered the thought for a moment. Then he shook his head gently. Everyone's supposed to die eventually. Elena didn't argue. She simply studied him the same way she had since the first time she saw him step into danger, as if she were trying to understand something about Marcus that he himself refused to see. And though Marcus didn't realize it yet, the next stunt he had already agreed to would test that question more than anything he had ever attempted. Because this time, the jump would take him somewhere no one had ever escaped alive. The injury healed slowly within a few weeks. Videos of Marcus' recent fall circulated online, fueling the strange mythology that had begun forming around him. The man who could not die had finally been hurt, and still walked away. Elena, who stood near the edges of all his stunts, who held the same small notebook against her chest, began to follow him. Certain nights they ate near the river where the city lights trembled across the water. Marcus never admitted it aloud, but those quiet conversations had begun to interfere with something he once carried easily: his indifference toward living. One evening, he returned to the small house his brother had lent him. The place sat on a quiet street where the porch light flickered weakly against the dark. Marcus stepped inside and tossed his jacket onto the couch, rubbing his shoulder absently, while the silence of the empty house settled around him. The joint still ached if he moved it too fast. The first real injury he had taken during a stunt. For months he had stepped into danger with the quiet confidence that somehow, inexplicably, things would always work out. Now, the memory of the rooftop fall lingered differently in his mind. The moment Elena had run through the crowd and caught him before he collapsed replayed more often than he liked to admit. He sat at the kitchen table and rolled his shoulders slowly. Pain answered back. Then his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Marcus answered. "Marcus Vale," a calm voice said. "We've been watching your work." Marcus leaned back in the chair. "That makes 2 million people." The voice gave a small laugh. "We're calling about a proposal." Marcus listened quietly as the man explained. "A major studio, a global broadcast. The most dangerous stunt ever attempted." Marcus's expression slowly changed as the details unfolded. A helicopter, an active volcano, a jump directly into the crater, $300 million. Marcus didn't speak for several seconds after the man finished. Finally, he stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the empty street while the weight of the idea settled in his chest. "You're serious?" he asked. "Completely." Marcus looked at the reflection in the glass. He's been waiting for something like this, something final. How many people have tried it? None. Marcus nodded slowly. "And if I survive, you'll be the most famous man alive." Marcus already knew the rest of the sentence. And if he didn't survive? The silence lingered. Finally, he said, "I'm in." The contracts arrived within days. Producers called constantly, discussing helicopters, camera angles, heat-resistant suits, global streaming rights. They had already begun advertising the event online. The $300 million jump. Marcus signed everything. But that night, long after the calls ended and the house fell quiet again, he sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the papers. After months without fearing death, Elena had entered the equation and made things complicated. He thought about her standing near the barricades during his stunts, about the way she had run to him when he fell, about the look on her face when she realized he was hurt. Marcus rubbed his forehead slowly. If something went wrong during the jump, she would be there, watching. The thought bothered him more than the volcano. Marcus stood and paced the kitchen. Maybe the solution was simple. Push her away, start a fight, say something cruel enough that she would walk away and never come back. He could do that. He had done worse things in his life. But even as the idea formed, another thought crept in behind it. She might come back. Elena didn't seem like the kind of person who disappeared easily. Marcus stopped pacing. His eyes drifted back toward the contract lying on the table. If he wanted to remove the distraction completely, if he wanted the jump to be clean, no hesitation, no fear, there was only one way to guarantee it. The thought arrived quietly. So quietly it almost felt reasonable. He could kill her. The idea sat in the room like a shadow. Not rage, not hatred, just calculation. Marcus stared at the table for a long time, because somewhere deeper than the dark thought, another realization had begun to grow. He had something left he didn't want to lose. Marcus didn't sleep much that night. The contract remained on the kitchen table, its pages spread beneath the dull yellow light above the sink. The words blurred together after a while. Insurance clauses, production schedules, release forms that carefully explained the risks of entering an active volcanic crater from a moving helicopter. Marcus had read enough. He knew what the jump meant, either a new life full of riches or a new life in another world. He liked his odds of winning the riches. He can get back all the money he had lost, all the money he could ever want, in one jump. He leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, while the quiet of the house pressed in around him. For months he had tried to force the moment that should have happened long ago. He had jumped from buildings, stood in front of speeding machines, walked into collapsing structures. Death had refused him every time. Now the universe had finally presented a situation where survival was nearly impossible, and somehow that certainty should have brought him peace. Instead, Elena's face kept appearing in his mind, the way she watched him, the way she ran toward him when he fell. Marcus stood up abruptly and walked to the sink, splashing cold water across his face. The reflection staring back at him in the mirror looked tired, older than the man who had first stepped onto a rooftop, looking for an easy exit from the world. He dried his face and returned to the table. The phone sat beside the contract. Marcus picked it up. Elena answered on the second ring. "Marcus?" Her voice sounded surprised. "It's late." Marcus hesitated for a moment. Are you busy? No. A pause. Is everything okay? Marcus glanced at the papers on the table. I got an offer today. What kind of offer? The biggest stunt yet. Elena didn't speak right away. What kind of stunt? Marcus exhaled slowly. A helicopter jump. Marcus, into a volcano. The silence on the other end of the line stretched longer this time. Finally, she said, very quietly, You're not serious. Marcus leaned against the counter. 300 million. I don't care if it's 3 billion, she replied. Her voice had changed now. Marcus could hear the fear in it. That isn't a stunt, she continued. That's suicide. Marcus closed his eyes. You know I've done worse. No, Marcus, she said firmly. You haven't. He didn't argue, because she was right. Nothing he had ever attempted came close to this. Why? She asked after a moment. Marcus didn't answer immediately. The truth sat in his chest like a weight. Because if this jump worked, everything would finally be finished. Elena, he said slowly, this is the one. The one what? The one that replaces my loses with riches. Her voice tightened. You don't know that. Marcus looked down at the contract again. I know the odds. Another silence. Then Elena spoke again, softer now. Marcus, don't do it. He could hear the emotion in her voice, the same fear he had seen on her face the night she ran to him in the street. Marcus gripped the edge of the counter. That's exactly why I have to. Why? Because if I don't do it now, he said quietly, I might not ever do it. Elena understood the meaning immediately, because now he cared, because now he had someone to lose. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Marcus, you're not alone anymore. The words struck deeper than he expected. Marcus looked out the kitchen window into the dark street. That was the problem. He wasn't alone, and that meant the jump had become more complicated than death. Because now he had to decide whether Elena was the one thing that might stop him, or the one thing he might have to remove before he could finish what he started. Marcus called Elena the night before the final rehearsal flight. The house felt unusually quiet when he made the call. The contract still lay on the kitchen table, the bold letters announcing the $300 million jump staring up at him like a promise that could not be undone. When Elena answered, her voice carried the same calm steadiness it always did. Marcus? I was hoping you'd come by tonight, he said. A pause followed. Are you okay? I just want to talk. She arrived an hour later. The porch light flickered as she stepped onto the wooden boards outside the small house his brother had lent him. When Marcus opened the door, she noticed immediately that something about him seemed quieter than usual, less guarded, almost tired. Inside, the kitchen light glowed softly above the table. Marcus had already prepared the tea. 2 cups sat steaming beside a small kettle, their faint herbal scent filling the room. Elena removed her coat and sat down across from him. You look like you haven't slept, she said. Marcus gave a faint smile. Something like that? She glanced toward the papers spread across the table. The volcano jump. Marcus nodded. Elena studied him for a moment. You're really going through with it. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid one of the cups toward her. I figured we should talk before everything gets complicated. Elena wrapped her hands around the warm cup. You don't have to do this, Marcus. He had heard the sentence before. From her, from the crew, from the few friends he still had left. But tonight it sounded different, quieter, more personal. Marcus looked at her across the table. You know why I started all this, he said. Elena nodded slowly. Your family? Marcus stared down into his cup. I should have been in that car. You don't know that. I do. The words came out flat, worn from countless days of repetition. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sliding across the window before fading away. Elena lifted the cup and took a small sip. Marcus watched her carefully. I used to think death would come quickly, he said. One good fall, one wrong step. But it didn't. No. He leaned back in the chair. And then you showed up. Elena tilted her head slightly. I don't think that's a bad thing. Marcus looked at her. That's the problem. The words hung in the air between them. Elena took another sip of tea. You're allowed to move on, Marcus. Marcus shook his head. No, I'm not. Silence returned to the room. Elena studied him carefully now, sensing something unsettled beneath the conversation. You're scaring me a little, she said softly. Marcus didn't answer. He simply watched as she lifted the cup again. Another sip, then another. For a while they talked about ordinary things. The river, her writing, the strange crowds that followed his stunts. But slowly her voice began to soften. The cup lowered in her hands. Marcus, she blinked slowly. What did you... Her words drifted off. The cup slipped from her fingers and rolled across the table. Marcus stood quickly, catching her before she slid from the chair. He eased her gently onto the couch. Her breathing slowed, her body relaxed. Within moments she was still. The room fell silent. Marcus remained standing beside her for a long time. The finality of it settled slowly into the quiet house. For a moment, his composure cracked. A tear slid down his cheek as he knelt beside her. I'm sorry, he whispered. His hand rested gently on her shoulder. It had been the hardest decision he had made in years. Harder than jumping from buildings. Harder than stepping in front of trains. But it was necessary. Because if Elena had remained in his life, he might have started wanting to live again. Marcus stood slowly and wiped his face. The helicopter flight was scheduled for the morning, and now nothing remained that could stop him. The jump could proceed exactly as planned. The morning of the jump arrived beneath a pale gray sky. Marcus stood beside the helicopter on the landing pad carved into the mountainside, while production crews moved around him with focused urgency. Cameras were mounted to the aircraft. Drones hovered in the distance, and technicians adjusted the heat-resistant suit he wore over his clothes. Below the ridge, the volcano breathed. A low rumble rolled up from the crater, where molten rock pulsed like a living heart beneath clouds of smoke and sulfur. The heat rising from the vent distorted the air, bending the horizon in faint shimmering waves. Marcus looked down into it. He had chased death across rooftops, highways, and collapsing buildings. Now it waited openly. He needed to defy death one more time. The crew spoke excitedly around him. The world is watching. Global broadcast begins in 30 seconds. This is going to be history. Marcus barely heard them. His mind kept returning to the quiet house the night before. The teacups. Elena's voice fading mid-sentence. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then the pilot waved him toward the helicopter. Marcus climbed inside. The rotors roared to life, chopping through the morning air as the aircraft lifted slowly off the landing pad. The mountains shrank beneath them as the helicopter circled toward the volcano's open mouth. From above, the crater looked enormous, a burning wound in the earth. The helicopter hovered over the center while cameras locked into position around him. A producer's voice crackled through the headset. Marcus, you're live worldwide. He stepped toward the open door. Wind tore through the cabin, whipping against his suit, while the heat rising from the crater brushed his face like the breath of an enormous furnace. Marcus gripped the doorframe. Below him, the molten lava churned in slow, violent currents, glowing orange and red beneath layers of smoke. No one had ever attempted this. No one had ever survived it. The moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. Marcus took one last breath and jumped. The helicopter vanished above him as gravity took hold. The world rushed upward in a blur of heat and light, while the roar of the volcano swallowed the sound of the helicopter blades. Marcus fell straight into the crater. For a brief second, just before the heat became unbearable, he felt something strange inside his chest. Not fear, not relief, regret. The thought of Elena flashed across his mind, the memory of her standing in crowds, sitting across from him in quiet diners, asking questions no one else had ever asked. For the first time since the accident, Marcus wondered what life might have looked like if he had chosen differently. Then the lava rushed up to meet him. Far above the volcano, the helicopter circled once before turning away. Back at the quiet house in the city, the morning sun slipped through the kitchen window. The teacups still sat on the table, and on the couch. Elena opened her eyes. She was never dead. She sat up slowly, brushing her hair from her face, while the faint taste of herbs lingered on her tongue. Across the room, a tall, balding man in a dark suit stood beside the window, watching the sunrise. The bartender. "Elena," he said calmly. She looked toward him. "It's finished?" The man nodded. "Marcus Vale has completed the jump." Elena stood and walked to the window, gazing toward the distant mountains where the volcano stood unseen beyond the horizon. "I was his angel," she said softly, "protecting him from himself." She closed her eyes briefly. "It's sad he had to go to hell, when he could have remained in heaven with me." The man beside the window gave a faint smile. "Just like the others." The man looked back toward the horizon. "Like all the ones who made the jump."
In a world where stories are the essence of life, what if you could be part of creating the next great tale? Introducing Storybook, a community where your imagination comes to life. A place where writers, readers, and dreamers unite to create something extraordinary. With Storybook, your ideas, your stories, and your characters are more than just thoughts. They become part of a larger narrative. Less than 1 billion Storybook tokens are powered by the Solana blockchain. By holding Club's tokens, you gain the power to pitch ideas, give input, and even become a character in the stories you help create. Submit your stories, collaborate with other talented writers, and see your work come to life. Storybook isn't just about storytelling. It's about making your mark in a community that values creativity and innovation. From anthologies to graphic novels, from films to community-driven magazines, Storybook is where your ideas take flight and where your voice is heard. Become part of a movement where your creativity shapes the future of storytelling. Welcome to Storybook, a community where stories come to life.